What if I told you the strongest weapon in medieval warfare wasn't a sword or a catapult or even an army, but a wall? Not just any wall. A stone wall that stood still, said nothing, and watched thousands of men die trying to get past it. That sounds like fantasy, right? But for centuries across Europe, entire armies were stopped, starved, slaughtered, or humiliated by nothing more than a pile of well-placed rocks. This wasn't luck. This wasn't magic. It was pure strategic genius, carved into the landscape and stacked 20 feet high. You see, a medieval castle was never just a home for royalty. It was a full-scale psychological weapon, a brutal machine of war that didn't chase the enemy. It let the enemy come to it and bleed. You think castles were romantic fairy tale towers? Try climbing a muddy hill in full armor while defenders throw boulders, boiling sand, and insults at your face. Welcome to the dark truth of castle defense. This was unfiltered medieval warfare where the walls were smarter than you, the gates wanted to trap you, and the towers, they could see you from miles away, but you'd never make it close enough to return the favor. And here's the kicker: most attackers never even reached the stone, because before they could lay a single finger on the walls, nature herself had already gone to war against them. Hills, cliffs, swamps, frozen winds, endless mud. The terrain was the first killer, and many siege campaigns were over before the first arrow flew. You weren't just fighting a castle, you were fighting the mountain it sat on, and the rain, and your own morale. This was medieval siege warfare at its most ruthless, brutal, strategic, relentless. And every inch of a castle, from the top of the battlements to the filth-filled moat below, was designed to break you. Not just your body, your will. Because once you're cold, hungry, ankle-deep in muck and failure, and the men beside you are collapsing in silence, that's when the castle wins. So how exactly did a building become a battlefield? And why were some castles never taken? No matter how big the army, stay with me. We're about to go inside. I used to think the fight began when the arrows started flying. Turns out the war started 2 miles before I ever saw the walls. My name was Thomas. I was 18, underfed, overconfident, and marching with my lord's army toward a castle we were promised would fall in 3 days. We carried ladders, rams, rope faith, and a little wine. What we didn't carry was an understanding of what it meant to fight the ground. Castles didn't just appear where kings liked the view. They were placed weaponized with horrifying precision. Every hill, every cliff, every patch of slippery limestone was part of a medieval kill zone. We learned that the moment we saw the slope. The first incline looked innocent, but climbing it in chainmail while carrying a shield felt like drowning in metal. Our legs screamed. The archers above us didn't. They just watched and waited. This was the genius of brutal terrain defense. You don't need an army to kill soldiers, you just make them fight gravity. By the time we reached the foot of the wall, we were already breathless, soaked in sweat, and halfway broken. Take Edinburgh Castle, for example. That thing sits on a volcanic rock so steep it feels like the mountain itself wants to shake you off. Climbing it with armor. That's not a siege. That's suicide with stairs. And then there's Carrigssennan in Wales, built on a jagged cliff that becomes a slip-and-fall death trap every time it rains. Spoiler, it rains a lot in Wales. But here's the part they never show in the movies. Terrain wasn't just a physical obstacle, it was a psychological weapon. Imagine marching for days soaked and starving only to arrive and see your target perched 300 feet above you on an unscalable rock. The men around you start whispering, doubting. Morale isn't just dropping, it's tumbling off the cliff before you even start climbing. Some castles were surrounded by marshes where wagons and siege towers sank into soft mud. Others had only one approach path, a narrow winding trail fully exposed to enemy fire. We called it the Needle. You couldn't run. You couldn't dodge. You just walked into death in a perfect line, one by one. And then came the rain. Mud doesn't care about your honor. It eats your boots, blunts your will, and turns ladders into sleds. I watched men slide backward 10 feet for every 2 they climbed. Siege towers tilted, horses panicked, rams got stuck, the sky laughed. By the time we actually saw the gate, most of us already knew we wouldn't make it inside. Some castles took it even further. They engineered the surrounding land, dug artificial ponds, flattened tree lines, even created deceptive clearings to trick us into thinking we had safe ground until the ambush began. It wasn't just nature, they made the earth a co-conspirator. You begin to realize something terrifying. This was never a fair fight. Castles weren't just built to survive sieges, they were built to stop them before they even started. No one told us that the real siege was psychological. No one warned us that by the time we reached the walls, we'd already lost the part of ourselves that believed we could win. It wasn't the weapons that defeated us. It was the silence of the cliffs, the sound of mud sucking boots into oblivion, the indifference of a stone wall watching you struggle. That's how it started. And it didn't end there, because behind that terrain, behind that gate we never reached, there were walls so thick battering rams felt like toothpicks, towers designed to rain death from angles you couldn't even see, passageways engineered to disorient, trap, and kill. But we'll get there. First, you need to understand this. The castle never waited for the fight. It designed the battlefield. It chose your path. It broke you before the first arrow flew. And if you still think you'd have done better, I invite you to take one step onto that mud hill in 80 pounds of armor while someone above you quietly picks up a rock the size of your head. Let's move forward if you still can. We made it to the walls, or at least we thought we did. That was the first lie. Because what looked like a wall was a test. What looked like a gate was a trap. The closer you got, the less sense the castle made. And that's exactly what it wanted. The wall wasn't just tall. It was thick. Not a few bricks and hope thick. I'm talking 20 feet of layered stone thicker than a school bus is long. At Dover Castle, the walls hit 21 feet at their base. And no, that wasn't overkill. That was survival math. Thick enough to shrug off battering rams, to absorb the shock of trebuchets, to laugh in the face of medieval firepower. But it's how they were built that mattered more. Two stone faces packed with rubble and mortar in between. A sandwich of suffering. Strong, yes, but also flexible. It absorbed shock instead of cracking. A living wall that moved just enough to avoid death. And at the base of that wall, a slope, a talus. Not just to make ladders slip, but to angle the force of your siege weapons upward, weakening every hit. Every time we rolled a ram forward, it felt like we were punching a mountain with a stick. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. The wall didn't fight you. It waited. And when it did respond, it didn't shout. It crushed. The gatehouse looked like an entrance. It wasn't. It was a murder puzzle with a welcome mat. First you crossed the drawbridge, assuming it was down. Then you met the first wooden gate, iron reinforced. Then came the portcullis, a 500-pound iron grate that could drop in a blink. If you made it through that surprise, there's a second portcullis behind you. Welcome to the crush zone. You're now trapped in a stone hallway just wide enough to hold your fear. Above you, murder holes, openings in the ceiling where defenders could drop boiling sandpitch rocks, sewage, or worse. One guy swore they once dumped bees. I believe him. Arrow loops lined the sides, slits so narrow they looked like decoration until a crossbow bolt tore through the man beside me. He didn't scream. He didn't fall. He just stopped existing. And the genius didn't stop at materials. It extended into geometry. Every angle forced us to turn, slow down, expose our flanks. Some gates were fake false entries that led to even more confined spaces where death was patient and personal. Medieval catfishing, if you will. But the real terror wasn't in what the castle did to you. It was what it made you do to yourself. You started hesitating, second-guessing, waiting for someone else to go first. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were rats in a box full of knives, and the defenders. They were calm, efficient, hidden. You never saw the face of the man who killed your friend. Just a gloved hand, a flash of steel, a hole where a helmet used to be. Some castles built gatehouses that extended outward like at Beaumaris or Bodiam, creating a three-sided kill box. You walk in thinking you've made progress, and suddenly you're surrounded above left-right, all with no place to run. Others designed the path to the gate with sharp turns preventing you from building momentum with a ram. You couldn't charge. You couldn't even walk straight. You just twisted and stumbled like a drunk in a maze, except every wall was lined with blades. By this point, you're not thinking about victory. You're thinking about survival, and that's the castle's true brilliance. It doesn't fight fair. It doesn't fight loud. It breaks you with design, with math, with psychology. It makes the idea of winning feel ridiculous. And once you start feeling ridiculous, you've already lost. So ask yourself, if you finally got past the hills, the mud, the morale collapse, and made it to the gates of a medieval fortress, would you even dare to step forward? Because from here on, the real war starts, and the castle is just getting warmed up. We thought the worst was over once we got past the gate. We were wrong. The wall didn't stop us. The real nightmare began when it let us in. See, a castle never shows you its full shape. What you see above ground is only half the story. The other half is underground, where the dark thinks, waits, and kills. They called them Sallyport's secret tunnels carved beneath stone and chalk, narrow, silent, twisting like the guts of a beast. At night, defenders used them to slip out undetected. One minute the attackers thought the castle was asleep. The next men were screaming as fire erupted from behind their own lines. Then the silence returned. I've been in one. Once. It was cold. Not chilly cold, funeral cold. The kind that makes your bones hum like they remember every mistake you've ever made. You couldn't breathe right. The air tasted old, like something died and kept rotting in circles. And then there were the false tunnels, booby-trapped pathways built to invite and kill. One led to a dead end with spike pits so deep you couldn't hear the body hit bottom. Another curved just enough to make you lose your bearings until you walked straight into a flooded chamber with no exits. Some men swam, some begged, none came back. Castles like Craigmillar and Chateau Gaillard built choke points that lured intruders into silence. That's the cruelest part. You don't die in a blaze of glory. You vanish, quietly, in the dark. One tunnel I heard of was accessible only through a toilet chute. Yes, a latrine drop. In 1330, a group of attackers infiltrated Nottingham Castle through an unguarded waste channel. Imagine crawling through human filth in pitch black only to find the tunnel ends in a sealed wall. And it wasn't a mistake. It was a trap designed to humiliate before it suffocated. That's the moment your mind breaks, not from pain but from realization. You start to wonder if the whole castle was never built to protect life, but to design death. And it doesn't end there. Some tunnels had acoustic tricks, echo chambers that confused sounds made you hear footsteps behind you that weren't there. I once stood alone and swore someone whispered my name. I ran. I didn't care if it was enemy, friend, or ghost. I ran. This wasn't defense anymore. It was manipulation, psychological warfare written in stone. And the deeper you went, the worse it got. No light, no map, just walls that twisted like they were alive, corridors that narrowed until your armor scraped both sides. You start to panic. Not because you're in danger, but because you're not sure you ever weren't. Some castles installed decoy escape paths meant for defenders if the siege failed, but they'd seal them off to trap anyone inside if discovered. One legend says a knight tried to desert through one and was entombed alive by his own side. His ghost, they say, still knocks at the wall not to escape but to warn you not to follow. By now your sword is useless, your armor is a curse, and your torch only lets you see how little hope you have left. This is where medieval reality shatters the Hollywood myth. The castle wasn't just stone and timber, it was intelligence. Cruel intelligence. It knew where your eyes would look, where your feet would step, where your courage would break. And it didn't always need blood to win. Sometimes the silence was enough. The uncertainty, the question you whisper in your head. Why am I still going forward? The men who returned never bragged. They didn't boast about bravery or kills. They looked smaller, quieter, like part of them never left. That's the thing about trap tunnels. They don't need to kill you to win. They just need to make you doubt the ground you walk on. And in a siege, doubt is death. You think the battle outside the walls was brutal? You haven't lived through the war inside. Once the gates were locked and the drawbridge raised, the castle became something else. Not a fortress. a prison with better lighting. We called it the lockdown. Not for days, for months. We were safe technically, but safety has a price, and it starts with hunger, not the eye-skipped lunch kind, the kind that makes your teeth feel loose, that makes you look at boiled leather and wonder, is that food? Inside the undercrofts, those cold stone chambers buried beneath the courtyard, we stored everything we could grain: beans, dried meat, smoked fish, hard cheese. Salt was gold, rats were protein. You learn to chew slow, not for digestion, but to pretend the meal lasted longer. Water, more critical than air. Many castles had deep wells drilled straight through bedrock. Others relied on rain cisterns filled during better seasons. But when that dried up, you didn't die of thirst. You died of fear, because once water runs out, the mind unravels faster than the body. And then there were the people. Too many people. Every siege meant hundreds of peasants from surrounding lands poured into the castle. Families, children, livestock. Space disappeared. Noble bedrooms became barracks. Great halls turned into bunkhouses. Latrines overflowed. So did tempers. I slept beside 10 men, 1 goat, and someone's coughing grandmother. Every night we breathed the same air, sour with sweat fever and whispers. Every noise at night made you wonder, was that a dying man, or someone wishing you were diseases spread like rumors? Scurvy from lack of greens, fever from close quarters, madness from silence. There's nothing romantic about waiting to die in a castle that smells like unwashed bodies and burning pitch. And don't get me started on the latrines. Most emptied through chutes along the outer walls, smart during peace. But during siege, they became weak points, accessible, burnable, climbable, so we sealed them. What followed? You don't want to know. We drank beer instead of water, not for celebration, for survival. The fermentation killed bacteria. It also dulled fear, just enough. We weren't drunk. We were numbed. Numb enough to get through another day. Time inside slowed. Then it warped. You stopped counting days and started counting spoons, counting steps to the wall, counting heartbeats. And eventually, you stopped counting. That's when the real enemy showed up: boredom. Not the fun kind, the kind that rots your thoughts. You stared at the same wall every day, waiting for a horn, a flame, a scream, something to break the stillness. But silence stretched until it became unbearable. And then it snapped inside your head. People started talking to themselves. One guard polished his sword every day until the metal wore thin. Another whispered prayers to a crack in the wall. No one stopped them, because at least they weren't crying. Religious services continued not because we were holy, but because we needed rhythm. Something to remind us the sun still rose, that the world still turned beyond these walls. Games helped. Dice, chess, betting on rats. Anything to pretend this wasn't our whole life now. That one day we'd walk out of here. That we hadn't been forgotten. But we had. And we knew it. And when you looked over the battlements, you didn't see an enemy anymore. You saw mirrors, men starving, freezing, trying not to go insane. Just like you. The siege wasn't a fight. It was a staring contest with death. And the first to blink lost. Some castles lasted 6 months, others over a year. Not because they were stronger, but because the people inside were just a little more broken than the ones outside. And that's the truth they never tell you. Medieval warfare didn't end with a glorious final charge. It ended with a whisper, with a cough, with someone deciding not to wake up tomorrow. We were told castles were about courage, about defiance. But in reality, victory belonged to whoever could sit still the longest without going mad, to whoever could rot slower. And when the enemy finally retreated, when the gates creaked open and sunlight poured back in, no one cheered. Because the worst part wasn't the siege. It was realizing we'd survived it. But not all of us came back. So, what exactly made a medieval castle undefeatable? It wasn't the stone. Stone can break. It wasn't the gate. Gates can burn. And it wasn't the weapons. Because every weapon has a counter eventually. The true secret. It was time. Time was the sharpest sword in a castle's arsenal. The longer the siege dragged on, the more the attackers suffered, the more their minds fractured. Every hour without progress became a quiet victory for the defenders. The castle didn't need to fight you. It just needed you to stay long enough to destroy yourself. You see, castles weren't built to defeat enemies in open battle. They were built to survive the worst parts of human nature: fear, doubt, impatience, hunger, pride. And sometimes they did that without ever firing a single arrow. That's what makes it brilliant and terrifying. We think of war as action, noise, clashing steel. But in reality, the most powerful battles in history were the quiet ones, the ones fought in the dark, in hunger, in silence, with no music, no banners, just breath and waiting. That's the unfiltered medieval truth. The strongest side wasn't the one that hit the hardest. It was the one that refused to move. So when we look at castles today, ruins perched on cliffs, half-forgotten walls surrounded by sheep and souvenir shops, we don't see what they really were. Machines of controlled suffering, monuments to strategic patience, shrines to the brutal psychology of survival. And here's the part that hits deeper than history. This wasn't just about the Middle Ages, it's about us, now. Because deep down, we're still living in fortresses. They just look different. Some are built from routines, some from habits, some from fears we won't name, but the question remains the same. When the pressure comes, do you break or do you wait? Would you have lasted inside those stone walls? Could you have faced the cold, the silence, the endless stillness, and not turned against yourself? Think carefully. Because in a world that moves faster every second, sometimes the greatest act of defiance is to hold still. If this made you pause, made you rethink what you thought you knew about Castle's War or even your own limits, drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And trust me, your insights are the torchlight in the tunnels of this dark history. Hit that save button if this gave you chills or something to chew on at 2 a.m. Subscribe if you want more unfiltered cinematic deep dives into the forgotten corners of history that were never meant to make you comfortable, only aware. Because this wasn't just about castles. It was about what survives.